The day my husband's will was scheduled to be read, I learned a truth that cut deeper than grief itself. Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living, and sometimes silence becomes the sharpest weapon a woman can carry. I was still in the same black dress I had worn to the burial, still smelling faintly of roses from the casket, when I stepped down the staircase and heard my grandson's voice float casually through the hallway. "She's still breathing? Thought she'd be gone by now," he said, not whispering, not ashamed, as if I were already a ghost wandering through the house. His sister laughed, tapping something on her phone, and added, "Maybe we should check her pulse during the will reading." They said this openly, confidently, because in their eyes I was not a person anymore. I was an obstacle between them and the fortune they thought they'd already inherited. The house, once filled with warmth and piano music, now buzzed like a marketplace with the sound of drawers opening, shoes thumping, and greedy fingers slapping neon stickers onto everything my husband and I had built through decades of sacrifice. My grandson walked around proudly, tagging furniture like trophies. "This one's mine. And this one too." While my granddaughter used a home renovation app to imagine spa rooms and wine corners for the parts of the house they planned to claim once I, in their hopeful imagination, disappeared. No one looked at me. No one offered me a seat. My daughter-in-law arrived with champagne glasses, smiling too brightly for a funeral day, and announced, "We're celebrating his legacy." Someone behind her muttered, "And clearing out the ghosts," followed by laughter. They pointed me toward the mudroom as if I were an inconvenience in their celebration. A cramped little space that smelled of bleach and old boots. "You'll be more comfortable there," they said. I sat on a wobbly folding chair in silence, holding a paper plate of cold, dry chicken no one had bothered to heat, and listened as they mocked my age, my presence, even my memory. "She built soup. Dad built an empire," one voice said. "We can keep her pension checks if we forward her mail," another joked. "She's half dead already," someone else added as if I couldn't hear, as if my heart wasn't beating just as loudly as theirs. But while they tore apart my dignity, they forgot that I had a mind sharper than any of them had ever bothered to notice. As they divided the house, the land, and even my husband's belongings, I quietly slipped my hand into my sweater pocket and touched the edges of the document I'd kept hidden for years. A document with my name written in blue ink, not black, a detail courts never overlook. They didn't know that 15 years ago, when my husband's company stood seconds from collapse, it wasn't lawyers or accountants who saved it. It was me. I had sold every piece of heirloom jewelry I owned. My wedding bangles, my mother's emerald necklace, the brooch I wore at my engagement, and wired the money directly to the company's account. I had whispered to my husband, "Use it. Just don't let them know it came from me." And he didn't, not until now. They thought I was just a quiet wife, a background figure, a soft presence meant to be stepped around. But shadows have long memories, and I remembered every late-night strategy one wrote for him, every decision I shaped, every crisis I resolved in silence. When the laughter faded that night and they returned to their champagne and greed, thinking I was tucked away in the mudroom like a discarded relic, I walked slowly through the halls of the home I had built. No one noticed. No one cared. But my pulse, the very pulse they joked about checking, was steady, strong, and determined. Because I knew something they didn't. The will they were waiting for wasn't written for them. It was written for the woman they had erased. And tomorrow, when they sat in that room expecting their names to shine, the ground beneath their feet would shift in a way they never saw coming. Long before my family began circling the house like vultures, long before the neon stickers and whispered insults, there was a time when my husband's empire existed only as a shaky idea, a fragile dream held together with hope and worry. 15 years ago, the company they now bragged about, the same company they flaunted at parties and used to measure their worth, was on the verge of collapse. Bankruptcy papers sat on my husband's desk like a silent threat, unpaid invoices piled taller than the lampshade beside them, and every night he paced the living room with trembling hands, pretending to be stronger than the storm eating him alive. He was a proud man, the kind who carried burdens alone, afraid that asking for help would mean admitting weakness. He didn't know how to tell me he was drowning, But I already knew. A woman always knows when her home is in danger, when the look in her husband's eyes changes from hope to fear. One night, after he fell asleep with his face buried in his hands, I opened the velvet jewelry box my mother gave me when I became a bride. Inside were pieces of my life, my dowry, my wedding bangles, the emerald necklace passed down through generations, the ring my husband slipped onto my finger when he said I was the best decision he ever made. Every piece carried a memory, every shine held a story. And yet, without thinking twice, I gathered them all, walked into the cold night, and sold them one by one until I collected enough money to save the company my husband believed he alone was meant to protect. I transferred the entire amount directly into the corporate escrow account, leaving no trace except a receipt and a quiet resolve. When he asked me the next morning where the funds had come from, I simply placed a hand on his cheek and said, "Use it. Just don't let them see you fall." He didn't ask again. And I never mentioned it. That was the first time I saved the empire. But it wasn't the last. Months later, when the board rejected every proposal my husband prepared, when investors refused to listen to ideas that felt outdated and disconnected from the rising markets, he sat at the dining table with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, defeated. I watched him from the doorway, my heart tightening as he rubbed his temples in exhaustion. After he went to bed that night, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the same table. I pulled out a fresh notepad and did what I had once been trained to do in the years before marriage: strategize. Line by line, hour by hour, I wrote a new model, a fresh blueprint for the company's survival. I used market trends, projected shareholder expectations, logistical frameworks, and a streamlined supply chain reform nobody else had dared to consider. When I finished, the sun was beginning to rise, the paper edges warm under my tired fingers. I signed the document with a pseudonym, L. Brightwood, because I knew no one on that board would entertain anything written by a woman whose title in their eyes was nothing more than homemaker. I sealed it in an envelope and dropped it in the mailbox with no return address. 2 days later, my husband came home, holding that very proposal in his hands, excitement replacing the defeat that had weighed down his shoulders. "Someone sent this anonymously," he said, amazed. "It's brilliant. Even the handwriting looks familiar." I simply stirred the soup and kept my smile tucked behind the spoon. That proposal became the foundation of their IPO launch, bringing in over $40 million and saving the company from ruin. They celebrated my husband as a genius, a visionary, the architect of a comeback story. They hung plaques in his name, held dinners in his honor, toasted glasses to his brilliance, all while I quietly folded laundry and packed school lunches. I didn't ask for recognition. I didn't ask for credit. I only asked for the family to stay standing. But years later, the same empire I had saved with my own mind, my own sacrifice, and my own erased identity became the very weapon my children used to belittle me. They told the world he built success alone. They mocked me for building soup, forgetting that I had also built the safety they took for granted, the wealth they now fought over, the stability they believed they were entitled to without ever understanding its cost. As they walked through my house sticking neon stickers on furniture, thinking they were claiming my husband's legacy, they never realized that so much of that legacy had flowed from my hands. Every strategy, every turnaround, every silent decision, all mine. And the best part, the part they had no idea about, was that I had kept proof. Original drafts, receipts, patent documents, handwritten pages with my pen strokes, my curves, my signature, even my coffee stains. For years I had kept them hidden behind boxes of old linens. Not because I feared losing them, but because I feared losing myself. Standing in that house now, listening to their cruel laughter, I realized my silence had protected everyone but me. But things were changing. The same hands that had once fed them, cleaned their tears, fixed their clothes, and built their home had also built an empire. And tomorrow, those same hands would turn the story back toward truth. They thought they had erased me. They had only awakened me. And when the will would be read, The empire they believed belonged to them would reveal its real architect. One they had mocked, ignored, and buried beneath years of unearned arrogance. 3 days after the funeral, when the flowers had wilted and the condolences stopped arriving, my family finally revealed the part of themselves they had kept politely hidden during my husband's life. Grief had barely settled into the walls when they decided I was no longer useful, no longer needed, no longer worthy of the space I had spent a lifetime maintaining. That Tuesday morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps and the rustle of cardboard. My daughter-in-law, Clarissa, stood at the dining table with her arms crossed, directing the others like a commander preparing for evacuation. "We've decided it's best that she moves downstairs," she announced, not even bothering to lower her voice. I blinked, confused, and followed her gaze toward the laundry room. "Technically it's a utility room," she corrected, as if that made it kinder. "But there's enough space for a cot." I stood frozen, watching as 2 of the boys carried boxes through the hallway. My boxes, filled with my scarves, my books, my photo albums, labeled with cruel words like old lady stuff, donate, or simply trash. Upstairs, laughter echoed while someone rummaged through drawers that once held my husband's ties, his cufflinks, and the small notes he sometimes left me on anniversaries. I heard a suitcase roll over the hardwood floor. The master bedroom, our bedroom, already being claimed as if my memories were clutter they needed to clear out. A neon sticker was slapped onto my bedside table. "This one's mine," I heard a voice say. Another sticker appeared on the antique dresser my husband carved our initials on when we first married. They peeled away our life with the same casual cruelty one uses to strip old wallpaper. I walked slowly toward the laundry room they now called my space. A cramped corner with a flickering bulb, a rusted sink, and a mop bucket that smelled of bleach. A metal cot with a scratchy moving blanket had been pushed against the wall, as if I were being stored, not housed. My suitcase sat beside it, holding a cracked frame of my husband and me on our 30th anniversary, tossed carelessly behind the fridge hours earlier, because no one wanted to look at it. They had replaced the chair at the dining table where I used to sit, swapping it with a garage folding chair as if my comfort mattered least. That evening, as they sat at the large wooden table enjoying steak and wine, their voices carried through the hallway like venom in warm air. One of the grandsons joked about keeping my pension checks if they managed my mail. Another said the house smelled like death, and that my presence made it worse. Someone else laughed and repeated the phrase I had heard earlier. "She built soup. Dad built an empire." I sat silently on my cot with a cold can of soup I had opened using the tip of a key, because they hadn't bothered to leave me a can opener. Every insult drifted through the thin door. Quiet but sharp, subtle but deadly. Cruelty from family doesn't shout, it whispers. It slides under doors and settles in your chest. Yet as I listened to the sons and daughters I had once rocked to sleep mock the very existence that fed them, clothed them, and raised them, I didn't cry. I didn't break. Instead, I remembered everything. I remembered holding my infant son through long nights of fever. I remembered stitching curtains to warm the house when we had nothing. I remembered helping with school projects, writing college essays, and comforting them during heartbreaks. I remembered birthdays, lullabies, scraped knees, graduations, and every sacrifice that never made it onto the plaques now hanging in my husband's office. They called me a burden, but I had been the backbone. They called me forgettable, but I had built the memories they now lived from. They called me useless, but in the drawers upstairs, I still had documents that proved otherwise. Documents that could break their illusions of superiority with a single signature. Late that night, when the house finally grew quiet and the only sound was the wind brushing past the windows, I stood from the cot, my knees aching but my spirit steady. I found the photo they had hidden behind the refrigerator, wiped the dust from its cracked frame, and pressed it against my chest. This house had been mine long before any of them were born. I had poured decades of my life into every corner, every wall, every rose bush in the garden. And yet they expected me to fade like wallpaper. But they had forgotten something important. I still had a voice. I still had evidence. And the lawyer was expecting my call in the morning. For years, I had let them believe I was silent. Now, I was simply choosing the right moment to speak. The morning after they pushed me into the laundry room, I woke before the rest of the house, long before the sound of coffee machines and clattering plates filled the kitchen. I quietly lifted the loose floorboard beneath the utility sink where, for years, I had hidden a worn leather folder that carried the parts of my life nobody cared to ask about. It held documents I created in secret, drafts of strategies written in long, sleepless nights, receipts from jewelry I sold when the company was drowning, and a letter from the patent office that no one in my family even knew existed. With that folder under my arm, I walked 2 cold blocks to a payphone outside the pharmacy, the same payphone I used when bills were tight decades ago. My cell phone had mysteriously stopped working after the funeral, a mistake, they claimed, but I knew better. When Mr. Alden, the lawyer who had served our family for 30 years, answered on the other end, I didn't explain anything. I simply said, "It's time." And he, without hesitation, told me to come in the next day. When I walked into his office, he didn't greet me with pity. He greeted me with respect. I laid every document in front of him: faded receipts, financial transfers, the co-founder certificate with my name beside my husband's in clear blue ink, and finally, the handwritten pages of the IPO model I had written under a pseudonym years ago. He studied everything carefully, his eyes narrowing with every detail he uncovered. When he reached the original proposal, the one written in my own cursive, he whispered, "You wrote this?" I didn't speak. I simply nodded. He brought in a handwriting analyst from Stanford that same day, and for 2 hours they compared the strokes, the pressure, the signature curves, the ink absorption patterns, every microscopic detail that tied those pages undeniably to me. By evening, the analyst concluded the truth I had known for years. The proposal that built the empire was mine, legally and intellectually. According to patent law, I was the original inventor, and because my husband never filed a transfer of ownership, all royalties, residuals, and intellectual rights belonged to me alone. Millions, untouched for years, now legally flowed back to the name my family mocked. Mr. Alden leaned back in his chair and said, "You understand what this means, don't you?" But I didn't want money. I didn't want revenge. All I wanted was my voice back. I closed the leather folder slowly, feeling power return to me like breath after drowning. For decades I had watched my identity disappear behind aprons, behind casseroles, behind the title of homemaker, that everyone used as if it were an insult instead of the foundation they had been raised upon. I had erased myself so my husband could stand tall in rooms that would never welcome a woman with ideas. I had stayed quiet so my children could feel proud of a legacy I helped build. I had stepped back so the family would have one hero, never knowing they would turn into people who couldn't recognize the real one even when she lived under their roof. But now, with evidence stronger than their greed and louder than their insults, the truth was finally ready to breathe. I left the lawyer's office that day with the firmness of someone rediscovering her own spine. In my pocket, the documents rustled gently, as if whispering that the years of silence were finally over. The next morning would bring the will reading. A room full of expectant faces waiting to collect a fortune they believed they had earned by blood alone. But what they didn't know was that while they planned to inherit an empire, the empire had already returned to its real owner. They had mocked me, sidelined me, diminished me, but as I stepped into the house that evening, listening to them laugh upstairs, unaware of the storm approaching, I felt something rise inside me. Not bitterness, not hatred, just truth. A truth strong enough to finally rewrite the ending they thought they controlled. The day of the will reading arrived with a gray sky and a coldness that felt almost intentional, as if the weather itself knew what was about to unfold. The law office was modern, all glass panels and polished floors, a place too sharp and too clean for a family as messy as mine had become. They made me sit at the far end of the long table, on a folding chair again, because even here, even now, they couldn't stand the idea of me fitting into the same world they believed they alone deserved. My son Joseph sat confidently near the front, crossing his legs like a man preparing to collect the fortune he had rehearsed in his mind. His wife leaned close to him, pretending to whisper condolences, though I could hear her quiet laugh when she muttered, She'll be dead by next Christmas. Don't expect a dime from her. My granddaughter texted beneath the table. My grandson practiced his signature on a legal pad as if money were already transferring into his account. No one looked at me. To them, I wasn't part of this moment, just dead weight occupying air. When Mr. Alden walked in carrying a briefcase and a small silver recorder, the room straightened as though royalty had arrived. He nodded politely, took his seat, and pressed play on the recorder. My husband's voice filled the room. Calm, tired, but unmistakably clear. If my son ever speaks ill of his mother, he said, deduct $1 million per word. Silence suffocated the room in an instant. Joseph's hand froze around his espresso cup. My daughter-in-law stiffened like someone hit her with cold water. The rest of the recording played, listing insult after insult. Every cruel sentence uttered in the house during the days after my husband's death. All captured by the home security system they forgot existed. She's still breathing. Thought she'd be gone. Check her pulse. She built soup. She's half dead. And dozens more. Mr. Alden turned a page and announced the total deductions, an astronomical sum. By the time the final number was read aloud, Joseph's inheritance had been reduced to a few $1,000s, barely enough for a month's rent, let alone a lifetime of entitlement. He shot up from his seat shouting, "This is insane. That woman has been a burden for years." But the moment he said that woman, another deduction was verbally noted by Mr. Alden with clinical calmness. The room was silent except for my son's heavy breathing and my own steady heartbeat. Then Mr. Alden opened the final envelope, cleared his throat, and announced that the primary beneficiary of the estate, the trust, the royalties, the intellectual property, and all remaining assets, was me. The shock that rippled across the table felt like a physical wave. Jaws dropped, eyes widened, breaths caught. For the first time in years, every pair of eyes finally looked at me, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with disbelief and fear. Mr. Alden handed me the folder containing the deeds, the transfers, the proof of everything I had built in silence. Tucked inside that folder was also a handwritten letter from my husband, the last love letter he ever wrote to me, apologizing for letting the world believe he walked alone when in truth I had walked beside him every step. As I read his words silently, the anger, the cruelty, the neon stickers, the whispered insults, all of it felt small compared to the truth spreading across the table. They had buried me in their minds long before my time, but I had been thinking, watching, remembering. When I stood to leave, no one tried to stop me. They were frozen, held hostage by the realization that the empire they tried to carve up before the funeral belonged to the woman they never saw coming. On my way out, I turned just once, just enough to look at the family I had fed, raised, and protected. "You buried me while I was still breathing," I said quietly. Too bad I had one more idea left. Then I walked out of the room, leaving them behind with nothing but their own echoes. After the will reading shattered their expectations, the house that once echoed with their laughter grew painfully quiet. They had 48 hours to pack their belongings and leave, as stated clearly in the legal notice my husband prepared before his death, a notice none of them had ever imagined applied to them. It was almost poetic watching their arrogance collapse into panic. Boxes thudded down hallways that had once been filled with selfish giggles. Suitcases rolled across the floors they had proudly claimed with neon stickers. Catherine, who once scanned my home with remodeling apps, now moved silently, her eyes swollen, her hands shaking as she packed jewelry that didn't belong to her anymore. Joseph attempted a final apology, a trembling, "Please, Mom, we didn't know." But his voice cracked like a child's, revealing the fragility beneath years of entitlement. I looked at him, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with the calmness of someone who had finally stepped out of the shadow she herself created. "You spoke first," I said softly, reminding him that the will had simply listened, not punished. His wife accused me of being heartless, but I had no intention of arguing with a woman who'd celebrated my husband's death like a lottery ticket. Instead, I walked through each room slowly, reclaiming the spaces I once tended with love. I peeled off every neon sticker they had slapped onto my memories, blue ones on antique dressers, green ones on picture frames, pink ones on the silver tea set I polished every winter. I removed each sticker with careful hands, not because I needed the objects, but because I needed to erase the ugly fingerprints of their greed. When I stepped outside, the garden was quiet, the roses long gone, uprooted during one of their redesign experiments. But the stubborn pomegranate tree stood crooked near the window. And beside it, the dying rose bush I had planted when Joseph turned 5. Forgotten by everyone except me. I knelt beside it, watered it gently and whispered, "We bloom again." Not for the plant, but for the woman I used to be. The woman I had lost beneath years of silence. Days later, after the last box was dragged out and their expensive cars rolled away without a backward glance, the house exhaled. For the first time in years there was peace. Not the peace of emptiness, but the peace of truth finally restored. And in that calm, I made a decision. I sold the house. Not in anger, but because a place saturated with betrayal can no longer be called home. With the sale final, I moved into a quiet penthouse near the sea, where the sound of waves replaced the sound of ungrateful children. The patent royalties continued to arrive, untouched wealth I hadn't needed, but now finally acknowledged as my own. I started a foundation for women like me. Women whose brilliance lived in silence, whose sacrifices were invisible, whose ideas were stolen or buried, whose stories were never told. I didn't need applause. I didn't need statues. I only needed to rewrite the ending they had written for me long before it was my time. In my new home, on the refrigerator, I taped a drawing my youngest grandson once made, a stick figure version of me standing beside a giant light bulb with the words, "Grandma thinks better than Google." They may have forgotten my worth, but somewhere in a child's innocence, the truth had survived. As the evening sun poured through the curtains and the ocean whispered against the shore, I realized something. I had not just reclaimed an empire. I had reclaimed myself. My family buried me in their assumptions, but I rose in my truth. And to anyone listening to my story, to any woman who was ever overlooked or pushed aside, remember this. Your silence does not mean you are small. Sometimes silence means you are simply waiting for the perfect moment to be heard.